Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the slight mix-up in starting the session. A very warm welcome to two very special people for this edition of Universe Rights, which is presented by Sri Cements and association with Prabha Ketan Foundation and, of course, Siahi. This is our effort to bring international voices to our audiences pan-India. And this is a very special session because it was years back, 7 years back exactly, when Peter Griffin, who's the moderator for today, introduced me to Mohammad. And he said this book is called Border Crossings, and I think it's the need of the hour. We need to have such a book out on the bookshelves. And I said, sure, we read, and I loved the book. And it took us a while with constant feedback, and his UK agent also helping along the way. And finally, the book is out. So I'm presenting to you with a very, very warm welcome from all of us, Mohammad Tufael Chowdhury, who is one of the first few British-born Bangladeshis to have studied at Oxford. But right now, I think his calling is more about being a consultant in over 80 countries, advising ministers, CEOs, etc., being on BBC, being on Financial Times, Forbes, CNN. Border Crossings is his first book, but what about Mohammad is most special is his writing is most evocative, it is sensitive, you can actually picture every page as you read, and you can also connect with his emotions and feelings, and yet there is this specificity, there is this minute attention to detail, the power of observation, which is something that only if you read the book will you know what I'm talking about. And moderating the session today is Peter Griffin, who I think we go back to our Kafarati days when I was still learning to read and write, I guess. And Peter was one of those people who handheld and gently just nudged you along. And it was under him that we started the Kafarati Jaipur chapter. But Peter is a man of many, many callings. A very sensitive writer, travel writer, writes poetry, also has avoided telling us that he's been one of the most acclaimed journalists in the country. Last time I worked with him, he was with the Hindu in Bombay, but all said and done, and he's always there to help everyone. That's one thing that we've known about Peter. So with that, and without much further ado, I'm going to give it over to Mohammad and Peter to take it from here. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Meeta. As usual, over generous and, underplaying yourself and the large role you've played in so many other things. But we do have a timetable to get onto. We need to get into this, and we have an hour, and we should use it well. So it's a pleasure to be here with Mohammad, who I knew first as this high-flying executive who was in India for a few years and who was writing a blog for us when I was with Forbes magazine. And at some point, Mohammad said, would you like to read something I've been writing? And he sent me a chapter of a book, which, as Meeta said, I thought was from that first reading, was a very important book that needed to be out there. And I'm glad that it finally is. And, so many years later. So Mohammad, congratulations first on that book finally being out.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. And thank you for being there at the beginning to help me get onto that journey as well.
So I think we just start off by just looking back a little bit at young Mohammad back there in, in the UK, and your first reading per se, when we go beyond reading merely as where we see reading and books as something different, something that, people write books are entities. So what were your first memories of books and of writing and of reading, really?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So, I was born in London in the late sort of 60s, and my parents had immigrated to the UK from Bangladesh. My dad had gone to the UK in 1957, and my mum in 61, and you know, they married, and then we were the first generation to be born there. My earliest memories, Peter, of really coming into contact with literature and reading and so on was a little bit unusual, I guess, because when we grew up, my parents were of that generation where they were in a new country, and they were happy to be there, but they wanted their children to be very much in tune with the culture where they came from. So the rule in our house was you must speak Bangla at home, only Bangla. If me and my sister ever spoke English, we'd basically, you know, get told off by our parents. So it was only Bangla. Not Sylheti even, because Sylheti was the sort of dialect of the region of Bangladesh that my father came from. And they really wanted us to speak, you know, what they call Shuddha Bangla, like sort of proper Bengali, if you like, rather than Sylheti. And of course, at school, everything was in English. So my first sort of experience of reading as I grew older was mainly in English. I didn't read much Bangla, to be honest. My sister was much better, but I was not as good. But it was mainly in English. And to be really honest with you, and it's probably a bit embarrassing to say this as an author, but I didn't read much when I was a kid. I probably didn't read anything as much as you probably have, as what would be my impression. I think I really started exploring and reading a lot more widely, probably when I went to university, to be really honest with you.
All right. And when did young Mohammad first start to write?
The writing is again an interesting story. You know, I went through school. I got into Oxford, as Mita was saying. I read politics and philosophy and economics there. But I realized when I was in my second year at university, or well, probably towards the end of my first year, that I was not a very good writer, because I was sort of answering essays in the way that I'd been taught at school, which was, you know, in a rather literal sort of sequential way. And of course, what my tutors wanted us to do at university was to break questions down and reassemble them in different ways and to bring out all these insights. And I wasn't really doing that. And then as I went through university, I really started learning, I think, how to express myself a bit more. And Peter, while I was at university, I think that was really when I first had left home, had moved out, had moved into the digs at university, and started meeting people from all different walks of life, much more broad sort of, you know, gathering of people compared to whatever I'd seen before. And I think that's where my ideas started to grow, and my writing or ability to express myself in writing started to grow as well. It was then, I'd say, probably fast forward by another 10 odd years, when I'm in my early 30s, that I went through some pretty big things in my life. So one is I got divorced. So I got married when I was at just a year after university. I was married for about 10 years and then got divorced in the early 2000s. And I think that really sort of, that event, if you like, sort of got me into a little bit, sounds a bit cliche, but got me to a little bit of, I want to make a new start with a few things. And so I started learning Arabic, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And I started a short writing course at CityLit in London. And I think it was really around then that I started writing short stories more than anything else. And then it sort of grew from there.
Yeah, you know, when I was going across the part in the book where you mentioned that you actually had to retake your prelims because your essays were not quite there, and I was like, okay, now this man has come a long way from that, because I see the construction of your writing when I'm going through this book. I have encountered it, of course, before in the blogs you wrote for us when I was in Forbes, all of that. As a Western Muslim, as you identify here, as a reader and in popular culture, but specifically as a reader, did you find yourself in the books that you read, that you read during those times? Was it difficult to find identity in that way, representation?
I think it took me quite a long time to really find myself. I guess we're all probably always feeling as though we've found ourselves recently because it's always a journey for us. But for me, I think it was a little bit different because I didn't really fit into a stereotype that was represented in the literature, if you like, of the time, which is basically, and again, in the lens of calling myself a Western Muslim, I was basically a guy with brown skin, with a family origin from the subcontinent, but very much like a westernized person in my head. Like the way I was thinking about problems or issues was very much like a Westerner. But I was also a devout Muslim. So I think that particular combination, there wasn't that much around, to be honest with you. Now, obviously, we can identify in different ways, but that was one particular persona which didn't really exist for me. Funny you should say about the prelims. So I failed my prelims. That was my first two exams at Oxford, and then I retook them, and then I got through. But it's funny you should mention that because I ummed and ahed about whether I should say that in the book, because obviously it's a little bit embarrassing to say that you failed your first year exams at university. But in the end, I decided to go all in because one thing I've tried to do in the book is to, and I had to go through layers of, getting ready to reveal more and more. But I really did try to go pretty transparent in the book and put it out there. Now, there are some things which I haven't talked about because they're very private, but I've really tried to go out there in the book, and I've tried to sort of, remove those inhibitions. I've never spoken about failing my prelims before, but now I'm okay to talk about it, I guess.
So, as a rising, promising young executive, young man with Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard behind him and all of that, making your career. Tell us a little bit about that. And when you're in the kind of work that you do, communication, lucidity, the way that you explain one part of the world to the other, all of these are important things. And the making of you as a writer, really. So that's the reason why I asked you to just spend a little time on that.
So I grew up at a time when Bangladesh was regarded as a basket case, famously by Henry Kissinger in the early 70s. He said, this is a country that will not survive. It is economically and demographically not in a position where it's going to survive. So I had that on the one side, and we would be going to Bangladesh pretty much every summer for holidays. So I'd see huge amounts of poverty there, right? And then I was living in a country that was, relatively speaking, extremely affluent and stable and well off, which was Britain. So, I grew up with this whole desire that when I start my career, I want to do something which exposes me to, addressing these international imbalances. Like, that's what I really wanted to work in, which is why when I started my career, I was really working a lot in, a lot of emerging markets and developing countries, figuring out, how to open up an economy, how to bring in more investment and all that sort of stuff. So I really got lucky with the fact that I was traveling around and getting exposed to many different environments across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and so on. But it also meant that I got quite profiled as a Muslim because, I'm talking about times in the 90s and the 2000s when there was already quite a bit of suspicion around Islamic fundamentalism and terrorists. And I just sort of somehow seemed to fit that bill, because my passport had hundreds of stamps in it, some of them from, countries like Pakistan or Syria or Saudi Arabia, where I'd be working. And I think I attracted a lot of attention. And in fact, one of the things you'll find in the book is a fairly large number of literal border crossings stories. Border crossings is, of course, a metaphorical journey, cultural journey, as well as a literal one in my case. You'll find plenty of anecdotes from those airport types of situations. And if you can indulge me, I can offer one short bit now from the book.
Please do, please do.
Thank you. And I know that everybody's got short attention spans given COVID and video calls, so I'll keep it, I'll try and leave you hanging. The blemishes on the maroon cover of my British passport include a crease that runs all the way down it, like a whitewater spring descending a craggy alpine mountain. The officer turns the pages with care, separating the leaves with meticulously shaped fingernails. His professionalism and duty to care momentarily cushion me from the cold reality of my travel experiences today, littered as they are with an incessant amount of scrutiny and suspicion over who I am and why I am traveling. He too asks me about my reasons for traveling so much, about my family origins, and in particular, about my frequent visits to the Middle East. I work for an international consulting firm and am involved in a number of assignments around the world, so I have to fly around frequently. Plus, I travel a lot personally too, especially to the Middle East and to Asia. What about the trips to Syria, sir, and to Lebanon and Jordan? Were these for business also? As he poses the question, I catch him noticing the gold British Airways frequent flyer identification tag dangling from the strap of my knapsack. He cannot tell that I went to the West Bank last year, since at the conclusion of a 9-hour ordeal at the border crossing, I'd requested the Israeli authorities not to put a stamp in my passport, but to do so on a blank sheet of paper instead. Whilst his questioning is thorough, it is nowhere near as forensic as the Israelis, whose methods are purposeful and meticulous, full of mind games. I don't mention the West Bank trip. Mostly those were holiday trips. One trip to Jordan was for business. I wince at the memory of that awful meeting in Amman some months ago when the executive we were negotiating with walked out of a heated session. Do you have any particular reason for spending so much time in the Middle East? I'm learning Arabic and I'm like going to the region to practice. And I go to Saudi Arabia from time to time to perform the Muslim pilgrimage at Mecca. I feel a desire to get this questioning over with and to get out of Heathrow and make my way into London. Where were your parents born? The officer asks. My parents, I repeat back, looking at the officer, but mumbling the words under my breath. Since childhood, I've been forced to deal with such inquiries, a necessary evil these days for many Muslims who travel a lot, their privilege of anonymity in travel temporarily withdrawn. As time has gone on, I've developed my techniques to a point where I can confidently challenge when needed. You don't really need to know where my parents were born, do you? I reply, nodding my head gently in the direction of my passport, the Queen's coat of arms showing proudly on its cover. I'm employing the same tactic I used successfully when stopped in Milan's Linate airport a few weeks ago. But that was with a smiling and casual Italian immigration officer who looked like he just wanted to practice his English. Today, I fear, I've made an error of judgment by challenging this man, barely a few weeks after the 7th of July terrorist attacks in London. The officer looks back at me, speechless, and as the seconds tick by, I wonder what will happen now.
I do know what happened after that, but for those of you who are watching and you haven't got the book, you'll have to buy the book to read it, and I'm not going to let on. But evidently it ended well because Mohammad is here talking to us, well enough to permit him to, to be here with us. But there's a link there in the chat for those of you who have not been able to buy the book yet. I do suggest you pick it up. I've just been reading the book the last few days, aside from that chapter that I got to read 7 years ago. Mohammad, I want to ask you about this book, particularly, as someone who's been a traveler, a business consultant, advising governments, advising policy, things like that. One would, working for a big name consultancy, a consulting company, which a known name around the world, one would have thought a first book from you, a first non-fiction book from you, might be something about your work, about the kind of stuff you do, because that is fabulously interesting as well, as you've proven in your writings about it, and that I have read when we were quasi-colleagues. But why this book? Why did you decide to make this the book that would be your debut as an author. Why? And I would put emphasis on that in several different ways. Why this book? Why this book? Why this book? Why the book itself, rather? Would you like to take that?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Look, none of this was necessarily planned in that way, and I think that I sort of wandered into writing the book, and I'll give you a quick background as to why. So you remember I said before that I got divorced and I started doing a short story writing course in London, and I started learning Arabic. So let me just take you back there for a moment. So why did I start learning Arabic at the age of, say, 32 or 33? So the reason is because when we were brought up in London, and remember I said that my parents wanted us to adopt that sort of family culture, if you like. So along with that came understanding about our faith and about our religion. So as a kid, and like thousands of other Muslims around the world, probably millions actually, we learned how to read the Quran, which is written, as you know, in the Arabic language. So in order to do that, we learned how to read Arabic. So as a 6-year-old kid, I learned how to read Arabic. But of course, I didn't understand any of it. It's a little bit like many Christians who learn how to read litanies in Latin and maybe don't understand it. So I really didn't understand the Arabic. And as a kid, and I write about this in the book, I used to constantly question my elders as to why are we doing this? Like, why don't we understand this holy book that is so important for us as a guide to our lives? And you know what? I sort of carried a frustration about this for years. And I go into that quite a lot in the book. And it was finally when I woke up a single man and I wanted to start something new, I thought, you know what? I'm going to learn Arabic. So I started the Arabic classes. And about a year in, I'd really gotten into it. And I said to my teacher in London, like, where can I go and learn how to speak Arabic, like conversationally? Because it's a bit different to the literature Arabic that I was learning. So she said, look, go to Damascus because, you won't bump into anybody there who speaks English. So you'll really be forced into it. So I went to Damascus for a 3-week holiday and I loved it. And I also really got into the Arabic. And then I started traveling in the region and I started writing about the region. And I put my travel writing together in some blogs, which got, a little bit of attention. And I put my writing together and I sent it to a very famous journalist in London called Robert Fisk, who used to write for The Independent. In fact, he was based in Beirut. He actually wrote back to me, gave me a lot of feedback and met me. And when he met me, he said, look, you're not Mark Twain. Mark Twain wrote about Damascus and he's much more eloquent than you are. But you are something that Mark Twain wasn't, right? Which is that you're brown, you're Muslim, you speak reasonably decent Arabic. You are embraced by the people of this region without any question, which people like me, and I'm a white Englishman, I'm not accepted in that way, number one. But number two, you look at this world through Western eyes. So that is unique. That combination is unique. So you should develop that as your writing lens. So look, I went back and sort of thought, look, I've got all this travel writing, but what I really need to now start doing is talking about the context of my life. Why is it that I'm able to sit in Damascus and see something in a certain way? Well, it's coming from all of that childhood and all of those years of being an outsider in Britain, because I was brown, and also being an outsider in Bangladesh, because all my Bangladeshi relatives used to call me the Englishman. So it was those years of dealing with all this that brought me to having a certain lens. And it's that lens that I tried to develop, Peter. So by that stage, I did decide to write a book. But by that stage, it was the book that I had to write. Yes, it is not the rational sort of business book that you might expect from me, and hopefully will get from me one day. But this was the reason why this became the first book.
And how long was this book in the making?
I wrote it. I'm a bit of an intense person. So I wrote the first manuscript in probably about 15 months. And I'm talking about, I used to work for IBM at the time. I was in the global telecoms team, and I was probably averaging about 120 international flights, or 120 flights a year, which I pretty much averaged all the way until COVID hit, and then it went down to 12. But I used to write on flights and in hotels and in sort of cafes and stuff at night. I wrote it in 15 months, so I went absolutely crazy. I then took it to, I got an agent back in about 2009. I got an agent in London, and he took it to some of the big publishers. And they liked the book, but they said, is he a member of Al-Qaeda, or was he a member of Al-Qaeda? And my agent said, no. They said, look, if he was a member of Al-Qaeda and he's now like a partner at IBM, and I'm now a partner at PwC, we love this and we want it. But he said, look, the whole point of this is that you can be a Western Muslim. Like, you don't have to be a terrorist, right? So then they said, look, so we didn't get a deal. So there was no deal. Peter, then I picked it up when I met you like 5 years later, when I decided to try and do something with the book. And that's where we picked up the story again.
So a lot of the book is about the balancing of your Western way of thinking and of being an observant, believing Muslim. And as you put it in a note to me at some point, which is as a fully paid up member of a secular society. And I think that the audience here is, and the series of events is about bringing international authors to an Indian audience. So in India right now, we are living with what was a country that was supposed to be a secular country that is increasingly becoming polarized, where people are retreating into different identities, which is no longer quite, as welcoming in the perceptions of some, downright hostile in the, in the perceptions of others, of minorities. And you spent some years in India, living here, working here. Your origins are in a country next door, and a country that India doesn't think about that much, because India prefers to, by and large, it seems, devote much of its attention to Pakistan, with this uneasy relationship with China, and not quite paying attention to Nepal and Sri Lanka and Myanmar, Afghanistan, etc. Can we take a little bit of time looking at perhaps through the lens of your time in India, at this being a person of faith, living in a secular society and making that work?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it applies to many geographies, including India, but actually many countries. Which is that being a person of faith has been perhaps something which people sort of keep private, if you like, right? So nobody, I think, begrudges anybody of having a faith, but it's sort of kept private. And I guess that's something I've dealt with in many countries I've lived in, perhaps with the exception of America. In America, I think it's still okay to mention God quite often, if you're having a meeting or something. But in the UK or in other places, not so easy. In fact, in India, it's quite easy to talk about God. That was quite easy, interestingly. In Egypt, it was easy. But in Australia, very, very odd, like you don't really want to be talking about God in a meeting. So it is tricky. I think what I've tried to do, and maybe this is because I just like the hard path. I'm not quite sure what the reason is, but I've tried to always not hide the fact that I'm a Muslim. But I've tried not to go overboard about being a Muslim. So I'm certainly not someone who wears my religion on my sleeve, because I'm not interested in broadcasting to people that I'm a Muslim. But at the same time, I don't want to hide that I'm a person of faith. So that's the sort of balance I've tried to run. And that, that does come up with challenges from time to time. A lot of those challenges are mixed up with challenges of racism and other forms of identity as well. But the particular Muslim issue, I think, really became profiled after about 1980. So if you remember, in 1979, we had the Iranian revolution. The Shah was toppled by the Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, I sort of felt that after that moment, something changed, and Muslims, many Muslims in Western countries started to, if you like, have a newfound desire to express that they were Muslim. So men started growing beards, women started wearing hijab, and other sorts of things like that. And I certainly found that from that point onwards, when I thought about it, when I was writing the book, I think that that whole tonality of profiling Muslims really started to change. Because before that, I don't think we were dealing with a Muslim issue. We were just dealing with being brown. Do you know what I mean? Like when I used to get racist treatment at school, it wasn't because I was Muslim. We were all called Pakis. You know, even if you were in England, Peter, you're an Indian, but you'd be called a Paki as well, because Paki was the term to refer to, you know, brown people from South Asia. So that it was basically a racist issue. But I think it started profiling into a Muslim issue in that period after the Iranian Revolution. And I became much more aware of it, like thousands of others from that point onwards. I don't know whether I've answered your question. I've sort of rambled a bit there.
I do remember reading about that, about Paki bashing and about duck busting in a different part of the world, referring to the Bundi. And, it was sort of a spectator sport to sort of bully brown people. And in a strange kind of way, I also have these little identity issues here because of my name. And, I've had meetings where I've gone into where the communication has been entirely via email. And there's a little note of, a bit of polite surprise somewhere that when to see a brown-skinned person coming in with this white name, right? With my mixed ancestry, like you, in some way, in different ways, I will never fit in 100% anywhere. Being a traveler, you have experienced it much more with. I remember in Facebook at some point when we were chatting about something like this, and you mentioned the number of different places you've lived in. And I think you're pretty much the person I know who has lived and worked in more countries than anyone else. Another thing that we talked about, and I'm just looking at the time. Yes, we do. We need to keep some time for questions from the audience. But how, this is something that we discussed as well, about whether this book is a sales pitch for Islam or not. Because, for instance, you go to take some trouble to discuss your own differences with the way that the faith is practiced, with traditions that perhaps that are not rooted in the faith itself, but are in cultural practice in different parts of the world, which have now become sort of entrenched.
Yeah, can I come in there? So
yeah,
I think I'm glad you asked this question about sales pitch, because the tendency, I think, with a lot of writing about or coming from religious groups is there's expectation, I think, particularly from people in the community, that the book's going to be like, we're showing us in a good light and all that sort of thing. So this sales pitch point, I think, does come out. And in fact, I said that when I first went to university, I started thinking a bit more broadly. I think it was interesting because when I initially went to university, and this was the first time I was living away from home, in digs, I remember that some of the students that were neighbors used to ask me questions about, why do you fast, or, why are you praying right now, sort of thing. And I remember that I'd always answer in a somewhat defensive way, right? Like I was trying to justify, why is it that a Muslim has to pray 5 times a day instead of once a week or whatever it might be? And I was in a lot of justification mode, and that was my automatic form of behavior. And they started calling me, one of the guys there started calling me the recruitment officer, and he was joking. And I didn't like it at the time, but it was probably about a year later, I started figuring out what he meant. And I sort of thought, look, I am probably defending and justifying and selling this rather than actually living it. So I've tried to, through my journey, come to terms with that. And if I may, I'm going to ask for permission to do one more little extract from here, just try and bring that out. I wasn't thinking of these benefits aged 7. Due to the attitude adopted by my parents and Maulvi Sahib was like my Quranic teacher. Due to the attitude adopted by my parents and Maulvi Sahib that we must read the Quran, even if we made little effort to understand it, I developed a resentment for the entire exercise. Completion of an entire reading of the Quran, which I did by the age of 10 or so, was nothing short of a miserable chore. Tufael, you must love the Quran and respect it. I was unimpressed as to how the Murubbi, like the elders, could read the text at great pace but not understand any of it. Maulvi Sahib knew substantial tracts of the Quran off by heart, understood by way of having memorized Urdu translations alongside it, now relayed to us in English. Others would demonstrate how they could read at great speeds. Intelligent adults who would drone on in Arabic for minutes on end without the foggiest idea whether they were reading about a goat, a fig leaf, how to take witnesses, or the story of a historic battle. I concluded that the Murubbi's claim to infinite wisdom to be false. How could they speak of Islam with such authority when they were in effect so ignorant? Instead of respecting the elders, I started to find the tradition of such respect to be a shallow hypocrisy. So what I've tried to do, and you'll find it through the book, is, I've actually tried to be a little bit honest about how I felt we were somewhat taught about the religion or introduced to the religion in a way that was very much through a cultural lens and perhaps quite obligation driven in some ways. Well intended, for sure. I don't doubt the intentions of my parents or of the elders around us. But I think that when we looked at that from a Western thinking viewpoint, and a viewpoint where we, at school at least, were encouraged to ask questions, which in my family community was often maybe not encouraged as much. We came upon these, what we thought were imperfections in how the religion was being conveyed. So I think I've sort of really lived with that, and I've tried to really think that through a lot in writing this book. And I think that's been very important. So I'm hoping the book is not a sales pitch. In fact, it's really not intended to be a sales pitch. And I actually think that there will be some people in the community who will read this book and not be very happy about it, because they'll probably say, look, this guy hasn't done us a favor here. But the book's not trying to do that.
Yeah, you do speak of your own differences with things like traditions of touching the feet and so on, where you talk about falsities around matters which are Islamic, where cultural practice such as touching feet is passed on as being Islamic practice. That's one. The other thing that I hope the remaining part of that sentence is something that I think we could perhaps spend a few minutes on. The falsities about what is Western due to cultural jealousy of the West. And that is something that we see in a number of different ways. In India, we see it often in taking pride in what people achieve when they, move to other parts of the world. We see it in harking back to a glorious past. Islam has had its golden period where much of science, algebra, a whole lot of different science and everything has its origins in in that part of the world where Islamic thinkers, people who were Muslim, were thinking about these things and laying the foundations for much of science. And your chapter in that is about the way ahead and the things that you perceive as the way forward. Could you perhaps spend a little bit of time on that? And I'll just remind people in the audience, we're going to make time for questions. We're going to ask you to please put it in the Q&A box, and we'll get to your questions immediately after this. Mohammad.
Yeah, so I think this is another important point. As you say, there has been a period of time, probably leading up to about the 15th century AD, when there was a flow, if you like, of scientific, mathematical, chemical, and other sort of learnings and inventions and contributions, intellectually from either Muslim scholars or Arab scholars in the Muslim world, many of whom were Jews or Christians in Baghdad and Cordoba and other places. I think that really for broader reasons of history, such as colonialism, etc., that contribution declined, after about 1492, to be precise, when we had the Reconquistadores in southern Spain by Isabel and Ferdinand. And I think from that point onwards, until perhaps even now, we haven't really seen from the Muslim part of the world, like say from the places where Islam originated, much contribution on those fields. I think we're beginning to see more now, but that's coming actually interestingly from Western Europe and from North America. Muslim scholars in these places. That's interesting. So I think there has been that sort of vacuum, if you like, of thinking. But to be honest with you, I don't think that's to do with the religion. I think it's more to do with the patterns of colonialism and global economic development, more than anything else. But it's probably a long discussion in itself, but maybe I'll just hold it there on that one.
All right. Let me take a question from Vijay, who asks, let me invert the border crossing, if I may. As a Westerner, in quotes, do you find a gap or perhaps even alienation from the worldview of other subcontinentals? And if so, do you find that border more difficult to cross?
Vijay, that is a very insightful question. And I think that in a short order, I would say, yes, I do find that, and I have found that. And what you'll find in my border crossings is that it's been not just the challenge of not being accepted as a Westerner. It's actually been very much a challenge of not being accepted as a Bengali either. So as kids, our parents used to take us to Bangladesh almost every summer. And I would regularly be regarded or spoken of as the Englishman, whenever we went to Dhaka. And as a kid aged anywhere between, say, 9 years old and maybe 15 years old, 16 years old, that wasn't very nice. I didn't really like it. I was making this big effort to be Bengali, so I would speak Bengali. I speak Bengali fluently. I was speaking Sylheti by the time I was about 14. I'd be wearing a lungi. I was doing all these things to try and be more Bengali and to try and really fit in. But I would regularly be called English. And I'd be told, there was small things like when I'm eating fish, like if I'm eating, I don't know if there are any Bengalis in the audience, but if I'm eating koi mach, which I don't know what koi mach is in English, but it's a fish with very fine bones, A lot of the time, there would be an auntie or somebody who would say, oh, don't give the koi mach to Tufael because he won't be able to pick the bones because they're not thick bones like English fish. Give him the meat or give him dal. So I would often get these sorts of, again, probably not poorly intended, but they would really hurt me. And so I really feel this border crossing the other way around, if you like, Vijay. And I think that was a really interesting part of my journey. And I think you'll find in the book that that's something that I've really tried to cross over the years. And I'll leave it to you to find out. But definitely that's been an important theme.
Question from Syed Zaidi, who asks, you have been talking about Islam without, if I may say. Would you like to make a comment about Islam within, that is, the sectarian wars within the Islamic world? This came in as chat, not in the Q&A.
Yeah, Syed, thank you so much again. I mean, it's a very interesting question, and I think it's a topic which I probably haven't done justice to in border crossing, simply because the subject matter has been a little bit more personal. But I think you're absolutely right about those wars and conflicts within the Islamic world. I'll give you a couple of examples. So one thing, and again, this was going back again to this book not being a sales pitch, if you like. I mean, one of the things that I pick up is how as kids, I'm a Sunni Muslim, right? So how as kids we were given instruction about Shia Muslims. And we were given quite a lot of instruction about Shia, which did not paint Shia Muslims in a very positive light. Now, even as a 12 or 13-year-old, I remember being quite skeptical about that instruction at that age. And I remember going to my mum afterwards and saying, "Amma, is this really right?" And Amma would go, "No, no, 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 no. Don't take all that. That's not right." So you say it. I mean, even in those personal journeys that I've had, we've had to live with quite a lot of that, and hopefully try and identify it and deal with it. But of course, on a political level, which I guess is where you're coming from, it's a big topic.
It is a huge topic and much to discuss here. And, in a world where borders are of different kinds, and it's not just the national borders, it's so many other things that divide us, class and income, languages we speak, there's a lot of complexity there. And, step back a little bit. The chapter that I first read of your book, the one that you shared with me some 7 years ago, was the last chapter of your book about visiting the home, the ancestral village, not the home that you knew, but visiting the ancestral village for the first time, where your ancestors were landlords. And that feel of connection, how do you see Bangladesh today? As you said, the world was, saw Bangladesh as this basket case, extreme poverty, battered by cyclones, all of that kind of thing. And yet in today's era, we see Bangladesh outperforming India in some indices. You've been in and out as a person of Bangladeshi descent, going there for family, etc., but with the eyes of an observer who has seen development and advance and the embracing of technology, of growth, etc., in so many different parts of the world. How do you see Bangladesh now, and what are the battles and what's the pushes and shoves of Bangladesh that you find most interesting at this stage?
I mean, Bangladesh, I think, has defied most people who looked at the country maybe 40 years ago, including Kissinger, by emerging now. I think last year the World Bank rebranded Bangladesh as a middle-income economy, so it's no longer eligible for interest-free World Bank financing as of last year. So I think that Bangladesh has moved along and probably defied people's expectations. I've had a chance to see quite a lot of that. I mean, my father, who, as you'll find out from the book, was an immigrant who went to the UK with nothing. Actually, when Bangladesh became independent in 1971, soon after that, my dad had a bit of money by then. He actually started investing in businesses in Bangladesh. And he was one of the garments pioneers of Bangladesh in the late 70s. And of course, Bangladesh now is the world's second or third largest exporter of ready-made garments. So there have been all sorts of ways in which, from a personal perspective, I've been able to see how the country's moved on. I think there are loads of challenges ahead, to be honest with you. But I must admit, despite the challenges ahead, which are political as well as societal, and there are some very significant and deep-rooted challenges, I feel as though the country has finally got itself some momentum, in terms of overcoming some of those challenges. 5 years ago, I was called in by the Prime Minister's office to run a project there because the Prime Minister said that in 5 years' time, we're going to be 50 years old. So this year, Bangladesh turned 50. And she said that only 20% of our population have got a bank account. But by the time we have our 50th independence anniversary, I would like all government payments to citizens, like pensions and stipends and so on, to be digitized. So we set about trying to design this digitization framework. And they made great progress with things like that over the last few years. So things are really moving ahead.
And I do have a question from the audience as well. But while we're on this, let me ask you about, from your time in India and your view of the world again, through your travels and working in so many countries, how do you see India's path forward? to being a more important, a bigger, we are a big important part of the world economy and world society, etc. But being a leader in many other ways, justifying sort of in keeping with the kind of population that we have, for instance, having a say in world matters. How do you see India going forward?
I think it was Amartya Sen who wrote probably about 25 years ago, comparing China and India, and he presently said that India has a great advantage, which is that it has a free press. And the reason, and he said that because he was writing about the Chinese famine, which I think was in the early 60s, if I'm not mistaken. And the famine resulted in a huge number of deaths in Western China. And he argued that one of the reasons was because there wasn't a free flow of information that indicated to people who could supply food that food needs to be supplied. And he compared that to famines in India, which of course have seen huge deaths. But he talked about how in India, more such disasters are avoided because of the freedom of information flowing around and the veracity of that information. Now, in my sense, I feel as though India needs to stay on top of that, if I may say so, because I think that India's got this tremendous opportunity to emerge as a true power, a sustainably true power over the next 3 to 4 decades. But to do so, it must maintain those advantages that it's always had of being a free and open and quite democratic type of society. And I think that's really important. And I think that's important when we look at the context of India and China, but I think it's important more generally as well. So I'm positive about India, but I think there is a need to stay true to those fundamentals, I believe, about freedom and democracy that India stood for really well over many decades.
Lovely question here from Deepa Chowdhury, who says, midway through the book now, I already realize it is a very intimate account of your life. In your search for balance, you have dug deep into languages, scriptures, cultures, communities. So has the book helped you reconcile with it all, the emotional conflicts of childhood and your growing up years? Yes, Mohammad, has this book given you some kind of closure, of comfort with this identity as Western Muslim? Do you sit comfortably in that identity now?
I love this term closure. We have to find out where this came from initially. I'm guessing it probably came from America or something, but this word closure just means so much. Look, let me not do a spoiler on the book, but I will say, Deepa, and we share a surname, and actually, for that reason, there may be experiences or perspectives on life that we might share as well. There is a journey here which does move me towards reconciling many of these gaps. And if you like, I mean, history or looking back is a wonderful thing. And when I look back on my childhood, I realized that I spent a lot of it bridging these gaps. So the gap between not being accepted as a Westerner and the gap of not being accepted as a Bengali. And I was really bridging those gaps. And then, of course, there was the identity issue about being a Muslim, really a Muslim, as opposed to sort of some of the ways in which we were being taught. So I spent a lot of time bridging, if you like, which is why I probably ended up becoming quite a sort of culturally versatile sort of guy. But as a result of that, I think it has become easier to deal with some of those differences. For sure. So, but let me not say any more, because otherwise I'll be doing a spoiler, I guess.
We're at about 7:28 by my clock. Meeta, can we go on for a bit, or would you like to wind up?
I think because we started a little late, we can add another 5 minutes to the session.
All right. So I'll take a couple more questions which are sitting in our Q&A box. Pramod Sonar asks, can faith be restricted, bounded, or encompassed by any religion, science, and different beliefs?
Wow, I mean, that's a deep question, Pramod, and I'm probably not even close to being qualified to do justice to it. I think that, all I will say is that whether I'm a devout Muslim or whether somebody else is practicing as a Christian or a Jew or anything else, I mean, I think it's possible for all of that to be compatible, to be together in one society, which is probably where I'm sort of trying to go with the Western Muslim perspective. But boy, I don't think I can do more justice to that phenomenal question.
Yes, it did. I just wanted to throw, I mean, I was tempted to leave that question aside because that's a whole panel in itself, but I did want to just throw it at you just to see what you would say. Deepa notes that Mohammad, we share the same language too, Shuddha Bangla. Did I say that right?
Yeah. Ekdom Shuddha Bangla, ঠিক করে বলছেন. Yeah. You said it right.
Aparna Sahai asks, has it been frustrating or enriching experience struggling with different perspective? Has it transformed you in some way?
I think it's been pretty rich, Aparna, for sure. And I'm sure it's transformed me. It's obviously probably one of those defining, shaping factors of life, I would say. But honestly, in all modesty, I think the story I'm trying to tell is probably the story of many of us. I'm just getting an opportunity to tell it. But I think it's probably one that many will hopefully share, and probably would have been transformed in their own lives in the way that I feel as though I've had some transformation myself.
All right. I'm going to ask on behalf of Prem Kaku, who says, when you visited your ancestral village, did you feel for a moment that you should now settle down in Bangladesh? And I'd like you to take that, and perhaps you could read us a little bit from that lovely evocative last chapter, maybe a few paragraphs to end with, because it would be nice, I think, in this kind of thing to always end with a little bit from the book.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's a lovely question. I certainly felt as though I'd reached an origin point, when I got to my father's ancestral village, and it was meaningful, and I've covered it in the book. And Prem, if I may do so, and Peter, to your request, I mean, let me maybe read out a few paragraphs from that last section. We cut through the hustling abutment of Burunga Bazar on the road that meeting in Brick Lane in London years ago had raised precious funds for. Our car scrapes past goods held out by staring hawkers and past narrow shop fronts displaying dusty plastic toys, fresh fruit, and essential medicines, touchable through our open windows. Then, abruptly, the market sounds give way to a vast landscape of silent paddy fields and parched river inlets, their soil cracked after months of dry winter sun. We stop so that I can take a picture of a rickshaw wobbling its way down an uneven track. Children stop and giggle as I focus my camera. What is this European artistic doing to me appears Bangladeshi ordinary to them. Vote for Mokbul. Mokbul Bhai is our friend, reads a slogan that has been spray painted in neat Bengali lettering onto the side of a power transistor cabin, this being one of the more recent villages to have been wired up under Bangladesh's rural electrification program. The poster of Mokbul strangely casts my mind back to the pictures of Maronite Christian politicians hanging off telegraph lines on the climb up into Bashareh in Lebanon. Tufael, look, all this belonged to your family once, remarks Mumtaz Chacha, wistfully, with a generous wave of his arm through a 90-degree arc, a hint of melancholy in his scratchy voice. Of the 8 siblings in my father's line, Mumtaz Chacha is the one immediately younger to Abba. In their youth, it was these 2 pioneering young brothers, Mumtaz and my father, who left the family nest to go out and earn a living to support the younger ones. Their actions back then were acts of immense courage, venturing out as they did from a cosseted village life which had sustained the family for generations. Bar the occasional overseas trip, Mumtaz stayed his whole life in Bangladesh to build a career as a jute planter, rising to the lofty post of general manager of the world's largest jute mill. Now a bearded and wise-looking old man of dignity and grace, I recall a picture of him from the mid-1960s, dressed in a fancy white suit and shades and holding a tennis racket. I could carry on, but I think I'll stop there.
We're bang on time. So let me thank all of you in the audience who made the time to attend this event. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nita and Prabha Kaitan Foundation for inviting me to moderate this. Thank you, Mohammad, for inviting me to do this. And yes, thank you, Mohammad, for this book. I hope it does well. And I hope we see it out in India soon as well. And
yes, I think we are trying to make sure that the book reaches India very quickly. But thank you so much, Mohammad. I've been receiving a lot of messages from the people who've been listening so keenly to you and Peter, and how appreciative they are to us for getting the session to them. And I think it's just because you are such an articulate speaker and you have so much feeling and emotion behind you and the book, which is what comes across, which is effective. And Peter, God bless you, because you've really held the whole thing so cohesively together. Thank you so much for being an excellent moderator. I'd like to thank each one of you who've attended and taken time out to be with Mohammad and Peter and us this evening. We should be back with another Universe Rights edition episode maybe next month. We'll see you soon. Thank you.